Soulframe combat is tons of fun, but some of the game's controls can really benefit from customized settings. From accessibility toggles to input combos, let's talk about all of Soulframe's keybind options and learn how a few small changes can greatly improve your experience in Midrath. First off, let's talk about hardware. I play Soulframe with a keyboard and mouse, so those are the settings I'll be covering in this video. Soulframe also offers controller support, but since I'm pretty terrible at playing games with a controller, I've coordinated with Cinest, who should also have a video live for you right now talking about keybinds for controllers. I'll put a link to that below for controller gamers, but if you could stick around and watch this first, I'd really appreciate hearing what you think about how keyboard and mouse inputs compare to controller inputs, and how or if you think designing for both types of hardware might be affecting the development of Soulframe. So, for keyboard and mouse, many of the default keybinds are pretty standard for PC games. W, A, S, and D are your movement, spacebar is your jump, M opens your map, J opens your journal, I opens your inventory. These are all pretty typical. F is listed as Use on the keybind screen. This is essentially your interact button, another pretty common keybind, just like Control for crouch. I do like that you can choose either toggle crouch, hold to crouch, or create different keybinds for each. Personally, I like the toggle crouch and leave the other unbound, but I'm always happy for there to be more options for players that prefer different settings. G summons your sparrow, which is your guide, so that both makes sense and is conveniently easy to reach, which is important because you're going to be summoning her a lot. Soulframe's attack keybinds are also pretty standard, with attack on left click and block on right click, but there are a few combat inputs that you can't see just from looking at your settings. Despite what the user interface says here, in melee combat your middle mouse is actually your heavy attack keybind. Tapping your middle mouse button performs an immediate heavy attack, while holding it charges the heavy attack, causing it to deal more damage the longer it charges. When a heavy attack is fully charged, your weapon will flash with a golden glow and the attack will activate automatically. You do also use your middle mouse button to throw your melee weapon, but you have to hold down right-click first. The combination of right-click and middle mouse is what initiates a melee throw. If you have the perfect throw combat art for the weapon you're using, then you'll see this progress bar when you hold down both buttons. You'll throw the weapon when you release middle mouse or when the indicator gets to the end of the bar. Releasing your throw in the highlighted portion of your bar is called a perfect throw, which deals more damage and can also be enhanced by combat arts. If you don't have the perfect throw combat art for the weapon you're using, then you won't see a progress bar and will instead throw your weapon immediately when you hit block and your middle mouse button together. Once you've thrown your melee weapon, your attacks become an unarmed strike, but you can tap your middle mouse button again to recall the weapon to your hand, and you don't have to hold block for this part. Now, there is a part of the Torment Stag Fable that introduces you to all these input combos, but if you don't have a melee weapon equipped during this quest, it could be pretty easy to miss the significance of these combat prompts. I do actually like the default keybinds here. I just wish the user interface did a better job of explaining what each key actually does. And speaking of things that need better explanations, I should mention here that a precisely timed right-click will parry instead of blocking an enemy attack. This prevents you from taking damage just like a block, but a parry has no stability cost. Instead, a parry will deal stagger to your enemy, and if you have the riposte combat art for the weapon you're using, then a left click right after a successful parry will perform a special attack called a riposte. Bows also use left-click, right-click, and middle mouse for combat inputs. Holding left-click draws an arrow, releasing left-click fires the arrow, and holding right-click causes you to aim, letting you zoom in on your target. Holding a drawn arrow long enough will charge your shot, again indicated by a golden flash. Charged shots get an extra damage multiplier, and you can hold them as long as you like. This all feels beautifully intuitive, and the reticle aiming on bows is absolutely perfect. It would be nice to have a few crosshair options, but I don't mind the unobtrusive single dot. My only real complaint here is that releasing right-click with an arrow drawn will cancel your shot. There are other, less exploitable ways to animation cancel, so I hope this gets changed and we eventually get the ability to move in and out of aiming freely, just like in Warframe. Middle mouse button on bows will perform a hail of arrows. This rains arrows in a circle on the ground, and the circle gets larger the longer you charge it, although the number of arrows in the hail seems to be determined by your combat arts, not the size of your circle. Hails and uncharged bow shots will embed arrows in both enemies and terrain, and firing a charged shot near embedded arrows will cause them to splinter. Bows can block, but not very efficiently, which makes sense. They can also parry, which doesn't make any sense at all, and I wouldn't be surprised if this gets removed in the future, since magic weapons can't parry because it doesn't make sense for them either. Magic weapons fire on left click, but you can't hold your shots like you can with a bow, nor can you zoom in by aiming with right click. Instead, right click will hold up a magical shield, which looks really cool even if the block isn't super efficient. If you attack with a magic weapon while holding block as if you were trying to aim, then you will see a reticle dot appear, and your shots will follow that reticle instead of the game's target lock system. This makes magic weapons much easier to use in many situations, so I highly recommend using this input combo until we get some kind of manual control over the targeting. Magic weapons also have a ranged heavy attack that charges and activates just like melee heavy attacks with the middle mouse button. So, as we've seen, there are many input combos and interactions that aren't immediately obvious in game settings, and none of these is more complex than sprinting. Every weapon type has different animations for light attacks and heavy attacks depending on whether or not you're sprinting. Even unarmed strikes turn into a kick if you sprint. Most of the time this is just a neat artistic difference and doesn't affect combat all that much, except for Flyblades. In general, Flyblades work pretty similar to magic weapons. Left-click attacks, right-click blocks, and blocking while you attack lets you control your aim. However, your middle mouse inputs get a bit more complicated. When you're sprinting, using the middle mouse button with Flyblades will cause you to throw blades at your target in a heavy attack. If you're not sprinting, then a middle mouse input will cause you to orbit your blades, sending them whirling around you and leaving you without a weapon in hand. There is currently no way to recall orbiting blades, so accidentally starting an orbit will force you to either swap weapons or try to punch your way out of danger. What makes this especially problematic in Soulframe is how many things can interrupt your sprint. Even if you're using the toggle sprint in the accessibility settings, or just holding down your sprint button. This is both counterintuitive and tedious, and it makes it extremely difficult to keep track of which attack your Flyblades will perform when you press middle mouse. For this reason, I tend to use hold to sprint instead of the sprint toggle, just because it makes Flyblades a bit easier to use. It definitely makes my hands sore, but I find the Flyblades attacks just too unreliable otherwise. Soulframe's default settings have both sprint and roll bound to shift in one keybind. With these settings, you will sprint when you hold shift, dodge with a little hop when you tap shift, and dodge with a full roll when you double tap shift. I love that there's an option to bind sprint and roll to separate keys, although you currently can't leave the sprint/roll combination unbound. I just set this to an awkward key I don't care about, and then set the sprint and roll individual binds to keys I actually use, which still lets me choose my dodge type by tapping or double tapping. While it does make sense for a sprinting dodge to be a roll and a jogging dodge to be a hop, a roll will interrupt your sprint state, meaning you have to press your sprint key again every time you dodge, even if you're using the toggle. Aside from just being stressful on your hands, this makes combat feel way more clunky than it needs to, and it could easily be fixed with a sprint toggle that actually stays toggled. Hopefully this is already in the works, or at least on DE's list of things to fix in the future. Whether you're hopping or rolling, dodge is a key you definitely want to be able to access very quickly and easily. The best damage reduction in any game is not getting hit, so this should be a high priority key as you start to customize your bindings. I use a gaming mouse with side buttons that are mapped to inconvenient keyboard keys, so my dodge input is actually a mouse side button. This lets me smoothly move and dodge in any direction without having to do any extra gymnastics with my keyboard hand. It also helps a lot with Spectre Srikes. When you precisely time a dodge to avoid an enemy attack, a golden glow on your character indicates a perfect dodge. If you have the Spectre Strike combat art on the weapon you're using, then attacking with a left click immediately after a perfect dodge will perform another special attack. Spectre Strikes are really fun, but the timing is quite challenging, so having an easy keybind for roll is essential here. There are 6 other keys you want to prioritize just as much as dodge. The first 3 are your packed abilities. You are going to be using these a lot, so you want them in a place that will be comfortable for your hands. The defaults of 1, 2, and 3 here are not a terrible choice, especially if you're coming from Warframe and are already used to those keybinds, but I prefer to have these on my mouse side buttons so that my movement inputs can be independent of my combat inputs. I'll note here that I'm not using a super fancy and expensive mouse. It only has 6 side buttons, and these give me plenty of options for customizing Soulframe's keybinds. The next key you want to prioritize is weapon swap. I know some folks are going to disagree with me on this one, since it is possible to play Soulframe effectively using only your main weapon without any issues, but I favor bows, and bow combat is appropriately inefficient in melee range. Whether you're swapping to Flyblades for an orbit or swapping to a short blade sidearm for dagger combat, bow enjoyers will definitely want a weapon swap key that lets them switch quickly and easily. Going from charging shots to parrying an incoming melee strike is one of my favorite parts of Soulframe combat. It's just so satisfying. The default keybind of R is not a bad choice for this, but go with whatever is most intuitive and comfortable for you. I got used to tab as my weapon swap key in a game I played years ago, so I just stick with that rather than fight the muscle memory. The next key you want to prioritize is your healing potion. The default keybind of H is just way too awkward for this in my opinion. You want a key that's easy to hit quickly during combat. I like R here, but if you're using R for weapon swap, then Q could be an alternative, or a mouse button if you've got some to spare. Just make sure it's something that won't hinder your movement too much, because the potion drinking animation is long enough that you probably won't want to be standing still. The sixth and most important keybind to consider customizing is the Soul Steal/Soul Mode key. The default setting for this is E, which is much better than the Alt it used to be, but I still don't like having it on my keyboard hand at all. The reason for this is Soul Mode. Holding down your Soul Steal key puts you in Soul Mode, which reveals Mockery Souls and highlights certain interactables. There are several mechanics and objectives in Soulframe that become significantly easier when the thing you're looking for glows, so you'll want to be able to run around with Soul Mode activated. E isn't exactly uncomfortable for this, but it means you can't turn right while in Soul Mode. I generally dislike keybinds that hinder my movement, so I put Soul Mode on one of my mouse keys, and this is much more comfortable. It also makes Soul Steals easier without hindering combat movement. Tapping your Soul Steal key will collect a vulnerable soul, either a floating soul from a disabled mockery or an enemy soul from a smite. I wish DE would adjust the language here to make smites easier for new players to understand. Basically, instead of a critical hit, your weapon can smite an enemy, which renders their soul vulnerable. Tapping your Soul Mode key rips out that soul, dealing damage and recharging the pact ability that corresponds with that soul's color. Smite just feels like an active verb though, so most players talk about smiting as the act of tearing out the soul, and some of the game text also seems a bit confused about this. I would love to see the act of making souls vulnerable referred to as sunder, and then the soul stealing could be called smite. With unique terms for each part of this process, so many game mechanics would be easier to explain. Anyway, if I could only bind two inputs to mouse side buttons, they would be roll and soul steal. If this is possible on your mouse, give it a try. It's definitely worth it. Your consumables keybind brings up a wheel that lets you select a consumable item, just like Warframe's gear wheel. The only use for this in Soulframe right now is Cloud Quell potions, but I can definitely see it getting more use in the future. I have this set to Q because that's what I use in Warframe, but C is fine if that's comfortable for you. The reverse camera keybind just switches which side of your character the camera centers on. This is a waste of a key in my opinion. I do think it's useful to have the option to change your camera position, but this should be a setting somewhere in the UI, not a key that takes up one of your binds. I get around this by setting my camera to where I want it, and then choosing V for my Nightfold keybind, which leaves reverse camera unbound and locks my camera position in place. Finally, there are a few keys I haven't mentioned on purpose. I have one mouse side button left unassigned, and I'm saving this for the new combat ability DE is currently working on. This is our replacement for idle powers from previous preludes. It was going to be the moat rework, but now it's going to have something to do with animal interactions, and I'm just really excited to find out what kind of special powers I get from petting baby deer. I also haven't bound my E key to anything because I am desperately hoping that we get some kind of target lock keybind option. Whether it's target cycling or a lock-on toggle, I am holding space for this hopeful future. My Z key I'm saving for mounts whenever we get them, and my X key I'm saving for a weapon sheath and unsheath key. At the moment you stow weapons automatically when out of combat and ready them with a combat input, which I don't really like. There's no visual indication for which weapon you'll draw when your weapons are sheathed, so it's easy to lose track of which weapon your envoy will use when you enter combat. You can get around this with a quick block input before you start fighting, but I wish I had control over whether or not my weapons are drawn. That would definitely be my X key if I could bind it. And of course this video wouldn't be complete if I didn't mention controller aim assist. This is a controller accessibility setting that still affects keyboard and mouse players. It is enabled by default, but if you disable it hoping that doing so might help with the target lock issues, like I did, then you won't be able to perform ground finishers, which are a special attack that happens when you left-click to attack a prone enemy. I talked about finishers more in my older video on weapon combat, as well as some notes about the throw with melee accessibility setting, so I'll link that below if you want more info on what those are and how they work. But for now, just know that you need controller aim assist enabled for ground finishers to work with a keyboard and mouse. If you play Soulframe with a controller, thanks for watching this anyway. Don't forget to check out Sinist's video on controller keybinds linked below, and please let me know what you think of keyboard and mouse controls. How much do you think Soulframe's combat design is affected by planning for both types of hardware? Do you think adding more keybind options for keyboard and mouse would cause problems for controllers? Share your thoughts in the comments. And until next time, happy hunting!